Welcome to the video about the intellectual foundations of the witch hunts. In other words, we're going to be looking at the key ideas that came together, the accumulation of key ideas actually that came together by the end of the Middle Ages and the start of the early modern period, which helped to create the conditions which would make witch hunting more possible. Okay, so these are the key contents and focus of the video. We're going to look at, broadly speaking, 5 different reasons why witchcraft started to be taken much more seriously by the early modern period. And it's this intellectual foundation which helps to explain why the witch hunts could take place in the first place. And this, alongside some of the other videos that we've got about possible reasons, legal reasons, socio-economic reasons, etc. This really sits alongside those videos, and I would strongly advise you to watch those as well. Right, so it's really important to recognise from the start that the witch hunts were an early modern phenomena. They took place in the 16th and 17th centuries mainly. People had believed in witches before, all the way through the Middle Ages, but what there weren't in the Middle Ages were any large-scale witch hunts. That doesn't mean that medieval Western Europe was an easy place to live, and there was a lot of persecution, but it wasn't aimed at witches. It was aimed instead at heretics who were guilty of the offence of heresy. Heresy is when you are at odds or at variance, or you have different religious beliefs to the established church. And the established church at this time in Western Europe, because this is before the Reformation, is the Catholic Church. So if your methods of worshipping, if your beliefs about God or Jesus or whatever, put you at variance with the Catholic Church, you were at risk of being punished as a heretic. And that, as you can see in the picture, could lead to some very nasty punishments indeed. Now, the 3 big groups that were targeted in the later Middle Ages were the Cathars, the Lollards and the Waldensians. And what's quite interesting is that in the areas where heretics had been harshly punished in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, sometimes you also have the same areas targeting witches. That doesn't mean one thing causes the other, it's just an important thing to perhaps note down. The 14th century, the 1300s in particular, has been called the persecuting society because this was a concerted effort by the church and by rulers to really crack down on certain minorities, whether it be heretics or even actually Jews and even lepers, poor people suffering from leprosy. Now, right from the get-go, in the Middle Ages, heretics were associated with the devil. They had the wrong religious beliefs, and so they were accused of being in league with the devil, who's in opposition, obviously, to the church. What's interesting is that that's where we get this idea that is of the devil's involvement in things, that is later then pinned on witches as well. It originates earlier from the crimes associated with being a heretic. The other things that are associated with being a heretic are meeting at night, which later on for witches becomes the idea of the sabbat. Having these terrible sort of orgiastic meetings where anything goes, they're all doing naughty things with each other. They're trampling on the cross. They're making fun of religious ceremony and all kinds of things, and they're worshipping the devil. Now, these ideas make the leap. By the end of the Middle Ages and the start of the early modern period, they make the leap from heretics onto witches. And suddenly, the whole view of witches not being a very serious threat and not being a very serious crime starts to change. And perhaps the most important ingredient in this is this notion of the diabolical pact. So this has earlier been pinned on heretics, but by the 1420s and the 1430s, you start to get witch trials. This is when the witch hunts technically first begin. In the Alps, you get these trials in which witches are accused of performing harmful magic, but also in making a pact, a secret agreement with the devil. So what happens then is the witch offers their soul, because obviously their soul is going to be damned, they're going to go to hell, but in return for their soul they get material reward from the devil, they get sort of supernatural powers. The devil then leaves a mark on the witch's body, which is convenient for finding proof later, but there we are. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because there's been this long-held belief in villages amongst peasants that you can perform magic. The higher levels of society also believe in magic as well. But this idea of harmful magic that's been around for a long, long time now suddenly is made much more serious, because it's not just magic being performed in villages by peasants, it is magic that is being made possible by witches making a pact with the ultimate force of evil, the devil. That suddenly makes it seem much more serious. Now, how do we know that this is a really important aspect of the early modern witch hunts? Well, we know it because in those areas where there wasn't a belief in this diabolical pact, in those areas where that belief was weaker or absent, there were no large-scale witch hunts. And that strikes me as quite important. So if we think about southern Europe, Italy, Portugal, Spain, you've got a very strict Catholic Church in those places. But you never really have amongst the population this ingrained belief in witches being in league with the devil. And there are no large-scale witch hunts. The other good example is England. In England, there are no large-scale witch hunts on the scale that there were in Europe. And there is also, for most of the time, an absence of belief in a diabolical pact. So it seems that in those areas where you do have the diabolical pact, you get much higher rates of prosecution. So if we look at perhaps, say, a good example being the Holy Roman Empire, particularly the German-speaking regions of that empire, the belief in a diabolical pact was very well embedded from quite early on. And as a result, that was, there may be other reasons for it as well, but that was the centre of witch persecution in Europe. So another ingredient that we've got to consider is the changing status of witchcraft in the eyes of the authorities. So in 1484, Pope Innocent VIII, who you can see in the picture, issues a papal bull, a papal directive, an order, a ruling, if you like. And he says, you know, courts cannot deal with witchcraft in the same way as they would any other serious crime, that witchcraft somehow is exceptional. Now we'll talk about what that means in a second. He does this because he's being lobbied, he's being persuaded, he's being moaned at by a chap called Heinrich Kramer, who is an inquisitor. So he's a Dominican monk, he works for the Catholic Church. His job is to root out heretics. By the 1480s, he thinks that the biggest danger is not heresy, he thinks it's witchcraft. Well, actually, he thinks the two things are the same. He thinks that witches are the ultimate form of heresy. He's active in southwest Germany, in Western Austria, in Switzerland, in Alsace. He's an extremist, basically. And for some reason, the Pope takes on board what Kramer is saying, that witchcraft is a serious threat. And he issues this papal bull. Why is it a big deal? Well, if witchcraft is seen as an exceptional crime, it means that it's going to be dealt with in a different way. Now, normally, most courts did not take the testimony of criminals because they were seen as untrustworthy, or children because they were seen as unreliable. In cases of witchcraft, they would accept testimony from criminals and children. So if a child made an accusation, it would be taken seriously and could lead to a trial. So that's because witchcraft is being treated as an exceptional crime. The second issue that comes out of this that could make witch hunts more likely is that in Europe at this time, torture was used to get confessions. In the absence of other evidence, you would have to get a confession to prove guilt. Now, torture was used sometimes to get that confession, but there were rules surrounding its use. Often, and I think because of the fact that witchcraft is regarded now after 1484 as an exceptional crime, sometimes those guidelines, those rules were relaxed or just totally ignored by different authorities. It depended on a lot of different factors as well. It depended on how centralized the legal system was. But if witchcraft hadn't been classified as an exceptional crime, perhaps those kind of abuses might not have happened. That's not the end of the story when it comes to Kramer. Kramer is very, very active. So he's lobbied the Pope. This Papal Bull's come out. And then Kramer thinks it's about time he wrote down his expertise about witch finding in a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, which translates into the Hammer of Witches. It comes out, it's printed for the first time in 1486. But the important thing about this work is that it's reprinted 15 times, and it's reprinted in the 1500s and even I think into the early 1600s. So it's always there in the background. Now Kramer's been this very active Dominican friar, hunting out heretics and then later hunting out witches, and he really helps to create this view of the witch that then starts to stick in people's heads in the early modern period. He says that witchcraft is a very serious crime, and it's the worst kind of heresy because it combines worshipping the devil with other types of terrible behaviour, such as witches are accused of murder and all sorts. So he says, this is the ultimate crime, and therefore it's got to be punished by death. And if you remember, in the Middle Ages, that had not happened. And he's very much a believer in the existence of demons being active in the world. These demons are omnipresent, and they're part of the devil, or they work for the devil, and they're there in the background doing terrible things, manipulating people and all sorts. And in the Malleus, what he really gets stuck into is the idea of witches being women. He is very anti-women, which wasn't unusual at the time, but he says that women were more vulnerable to making a pact with the devil or becoming witches because they were changeable, unlike men. He says they were gossipy and had a slippery tongue, so they would spread their witch beliefs amongst their friends or family, that they were too weak to stick up for themselves physically, so they would try and get revenge if they were wronged by using magic. And here's the absolute kicker. He also says that women were less inclined, because of their natures, to believe in God. Now, none of these misogynistic ideas were new, but he writes this down, and he is probably the first demonologist or writer about witchcraft to explicitly link witchcraft mainly to women, and that is important. And the Malleus it's split into three parts. The first part is all about proving the reality and dangers of witchcraft. The second part is advice about how to protect against magic and how to prevent being bewitched, or what to do if you are bewitched. And then the third part is about how you should investigate and put witches on trial. And not surprisingly, he goes along with the idea that the Pope's put out earlier, partly because he persuaded him to, about witchcraft being an exceptional crime. Torture's okay. It's hard to get evidence any other way. You must torture these women. You must be merciless. Okay. Now, this is printed because this is the sort of period that the printing press is getting going. But the key thing about the Malleus really is that it influences a lot of later demonological writing, and it really sets the pattern for what witches are supposed to be. They are making a pact with the devil, and they are usually female. Now, our next key ingredient is something that had been associated with heretics in the Middle Ages. It's not a new idea. The idea of this secret meeting, this conspiratorial meeting at which evil deeds are committed and evil plans are made, called the Sabbat. Now you can see a great painting by the artist Goya here of a supposed Sabbat taking place. So the devil or demons are meant to be present in this case. You can see in the form of a goat, and then you've got the witches, quite large numbers, huddled around. All right, now this becomes an idea quite firmly embedded with witches rather than heretics by the 1500s, certainly by the mid 1500s, 1550. It's a pretty well established idea. It doesn't catch on everywhere. For example, it never really catches on in England, and often in those areas where there were no large-scale witch hunts, quite often we also find an absence in belief in the Sabbat. You often find an absence of belief in the diabolical pact, but you quite often find an absence in belief of the Sabbat. So what went on at these Sabbats, or what's supposed to go on, is you've got your witches getting together, and here's the pact with the devil being made, the kiss of shame, as it was called, kissing this demon's, for want of a better word, backside, and other terrible things would go on at these Sabbats by all accounts, and they would invert the holy. It was about sort of taking the teachings of the church and turning them upside down. So in this situation, rather than being baptized by a priest, this demon is baptizing this man using blood. So it's a reversal of good Christian teaching. And in this image, they are being instructed by the demon to trample on the Christian symbol, to trample on the cross. So pretty awful stuff. Perhaps the most important thing about Sabbats is that it's this idea of a group of witches, a conspiracy is being formed, a secret meeting. They're getting together, plotting, planning, doing awful things, and that means this is a hidden, organised sect of people, much like the heretics have been accused of in the Middle Ages. But it's anti-Christian, isn't it? They're in league with the devil. An anti-Christian heretical sect, that is, and here's the really important thing that the Sabbat gives you, that is seen as an organised threat to Christian society. And so why do secular rulers start to take witchcraft much more seriously? Well, perhaps this is one of the reasons, is that for the first time they're associating magic and witchcraft with a threat to the very fabric of the society that they rule over. So this is, I think, a pretty key ingredient. Now, I'm not the only one, because my hero Brian Levac says this in his fantastic book. He says, in order for intensive hunting of witches to take place, it was necessary for the ruling elite to believe the crime was of the greatest magnitude, and that it was being practiced on a large scale and in a conspiratorial manner. And if you think about it, if you take the diabolical pact, that makes witchcraft seem much more serious. If you take the Sabbat, it's giving you this large scale conspiratorial manner bit. You put the two things together, and the elite in society who control the courts, who are in charge of these places, are going to start to be more fearful about witchcraft. So let's think about what we've covered in today's video. We've looked at the intellectual foundations for the idea of the witch that becomes embedded by the early modern period. And there's a couple of ingredients that have been around for a long time that help to create this witch's brew. I'm being silly now. Existing belief in maleficia. So people since the Middle Ages and probably before believed that certain people could perform magic, sometimes good magic, sometimes harmful magic, maleficia. There has been in society since the Middle Ages and again probably before misogynistic attitudes, the belief that women in particular are vulnerable to temptation and to the devil. Now, what do you get into the mix? Well, we've already seen towards the end of the Middle Ages, in the 1420s and 30s, you've got the idea that witchcraft is some form of heresy. So a lot of the evils of heresy, the descriptions of heresy now start to be applied to witchcraft. You've got the emergent belief in a diabolical pact. Again, a hangover from the days of heresy, but it makes witchcraft seem much more serious. They are in league with the devil. Therefore, the Pope in 1484 says witchcraft is a really big deal, everybody. It's an exceptional crime. That leads to a relaxation of the way it's investigated when it comes to the way that confessions are got with torture and all the rest of it. So that's in the mix. We've also got this growing belief in the sabbat, this conspiratorial, large-scale nature of witchcraft, which makes it even more of a threat. Now, okay, so look, here are the intellectual foundations. Certainly by 1500, these ideas are all working together. But you got to heat up this witch's brew for it to turn into a witch hunt. You need some other things as well. Just the idea of what the witch was might not on its own have been enough. So in other videos we consider the legal foundations and the conditions that made witch hunting possible, because you couldn't have a witch hunt unless the authorities supported it, unless they agreed that it was a serious crime and that it should go and be dealt with by the courts. So have a look at the videos to do with the legal foundations as well. The other thing that historians have said is that once you've got this idea of the witch, if you then have some kind of social or economic crisis in society and people start to look for scapegoats, they're more likely to blame poverty, disease, war, famine, whatever. They're more likely to blame those social and economic problems on witches once that idea of the witch is embedded. So watch those other videos, make your own mind up, and I hope this was useful.